Howdy, and welcome to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. The Preaching Poetry Podcast uses poetry to inspire conversation and to rediscover the world. Let's get to it. Welcome back to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. It is good to be with you again. Today, the poem we're going to be reading is called Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelly. Now, the first thing that you may notice if you actually try to go look up Percy Bysshe Shelly, his middle name, the Bysshe, is spelled B-Y-S-S-H-E. So you might hear people pronounce it Bysshe or Bysshe or whatever, but I'm pretty sure that it's supposed to be Bysshe. Just a little bit of a disclaimer there. If you're looking it up, you may have a hard time spelling that. Anyway, this is his poem called Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Woo! Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? So this poem right here is a sonnet. Okay, it has 14 different lines, but it is not like a traditional Shakespearean sonnet with the alternate rhymes. So you might have A, B, C, D, C, D, E, E. Right? That's how you'll do some of those where the last line is a rhyme, the last two lines rhyme together, but then it's every other line until you get down to the end. It doesn't work like that. So the pattern in this poem, if you look at it, it'll be easier to see. But there are 4 sets of 2, okay, 2 rhymes, and then 2 sets of 3 rhymes. And so when you read it, the meter still pretty well keeps together, but if you try to read it like a poem, it makes it a little bit harder to understand. So I suggest paying attention to the punctuation. And then if you're trying to read it out loud, pay attention to the lines in the poem, but don't get stuck at the end of each line and think you have to make them rhyme together, because they're not always going to do that exactly. Okay, so not a Shakespearean sonnet, but still a sonnet because it's got the 14 lines. Okay, so it has that formula. Before we get any further on into the poem itself, let's take a second to talk about our boy Percy Bysshe Shelly. Okay, he wrote this poem after hearing of a discovery of a statue in Egypt, and he heard about the inscription on its base. So he was hearing some different stories about these statues that had been discovered. I don't know how just familiar you are with Egyptian history or with English history, but what he's talking about is a statue that was discovered in Egypt. Okay, and so when Napoleon ends up in Egypt and, he takes over it and fights a bunch of battles and then kind of runs away because he knows he's going to lose if he gets stuck there forever, that sort of kicked off some major archaeological exploration by these different European groups. And so you may have heard of the Rosetta Stone, that sort of thing. There's a lot of exploration, European exploration and archaeology starting in Egypt, sort of in and around the 1800s, starting kind of with Napoleon. But anyway, this discovery has been made, and Percy is listening to his buddy talk about this statue that they found. The statue of Ozymandias. And Ozymandias, the name Ozymandias means "so goes glory," and this may also just be a different name for the pharaoh that we would call Ramses II. Okay, so Ramses II was an Egyptian pharaoh, a powerful one of the greatest pharaohs, often called Ramses the Great. Okay, there is some speculation that he might be the pharaoh of Egypt during the Bible story of the Exodus, but there's a lot of debate about how to date the Exodus, how to understand that story, how to read it, when it would have happened, how many years do you have to go backwards in time to find it, and then you've got the sort of the stuff that you can find archaeological evidence kind of pointing different ways, and then there's some things you just can't find at all. So we don't know for sure if Ramses was the pharaoh of the Exodus, but a lot of people think so. And so it's kind of interesting if you think about him that way. But the idea here is that you had this Egyptian kingdom that flourished for, goodness gracious, thousands and thousands of years, long before any of these other civilizations pop up. The Nile River Valley just sort of was that unique place in the ancient world where you had reliable weather patterns, predictable source of water, and good soil, and then you're also pretty well protected from outsiders because they can't really come at you except the closer you get to the Mediterranean, but they're not going to be able to make it through just sheer desert. You're not going to see large armies just marching through the desert to get to the Nile. They're going to have to get close to water. So it's pretty easy to defend Egypt. It's pretty easy to keep it a coherent civilization because you've got this river that you can sail up and down, that makes travel easy, that makes defense easy, that gives you water and gives you ways to, fertile soil from the Nile River as it gathers sediment and soil from other places, and as the river flows into the Mediterranean Sea, it drops off a lot of these nutrients. So it's a very good soil, very good place to be. And so the Egyptian civilization was pretty fantastic and pretty advanced. However, if you keep going through Egypt's history, you have sort of the decline of the pharaohs after, well, you could say after the Persians come in and take over, or after Alexander the Great, or after Ptolemy, or after Cleopatra. So you can make a case for a lot of different ends to this sort of, Egyptian identity. But for the most part, the idea here is that there was a flourishing civilization, a powerful civilization, and eventually what happens is that Egypt is sort of swept up in larger things. So you have Alexander the Great's empire. He comes in and conquers Egypt. Okay, and you have the Ptolemies who rule Egypt, but they basically rule it as Greeks. And so that's, Ptolemy, that's Cleopatra. Later, Egypt becomes a sort of principality belonging to the Roman Empire under the direct control of the emperor. It evolves over time. You have the Byzantine Empire, but Egypt sort of stays a part of that, and it doesn't ever really regain a sort of truly independent streak, because you have the Byzantines, and as their rule and power sort of wanes, you have the rise of the Ottoman Empire. You have other sort of powerful. You have the caliphates. You have these different sort of larger imperial powers that take over Egypt. But the idea here is that the statue that Percy Bysshe Shelly is talking about, they think it was a statue of Ramses the Great that was probably destroyed by Christian monks as Christianity sort of became, particularly of the Coptic variety, became sort of the most influential religion in Egypt, sort of in that Roman period. And then, of course, with the rise of the caliphates and Islam, you have Islam start to take over as the most influential religion in the area. But you can imagine that these sort of monotheists, the Christians and the Muslims, are not going to be terribly happy with this, with all of the paganism of ancient Egypt. And so the idea is that a lot of these statues were destroyed. And so Percy Bysshe Shelley is talking to a buddy of his, and they've discovered some of these destroyed statues. And so, I think it's kind of cool to think about. You have maybe the statue of Ramses, maybe the Pharaoh of Egypt that was maybe destroyed by monks. So you might have this sort of interesting little connection here to the Old Testament, the New Testament. Maybe call it poetic justice, whatever you may think. But the story that he's telling, he starts with this. He says that I met a traveler from an antique land. And I love the way that he uses the word antique. He doesn't just say old or aged. He says antique land. This is an old place. Okay? So the Pharaoh, who this is probably a statue of, Ozymandias, Ramses the Great, was a pharaoh who ruled in the Bronze Age. For reference, he would have died about 3,200 years ago. That's 3,200. That's a long time ago. Okay, to give you a little bit of a frame of reference, George Washington was born not quite 300 years ago. So, antique may be a little bit of an understatement, right? When we think of an antique, we think of something that's old, but we wouldn't call it like an artifact. But essentially, I love that word that he calls it an antique land. It's sort of this, old, shrouded in mystery. I like that language. So he meets a traveler from an antique land, okay? And then they talk about this colossus, okay? And a colossus was a giant statue that was built in honor of a pharaoh, okay? Lots of them were built. Some of them still kind of exist. If you're familiar with the statue of the Sphinx, that is kind of like a colossus, okay? And you can still find colossus around today. There are some even of Ramses II. And so, but he says they come up upon two vast and trunkless legs of stone. So trunkless means that there's no torso. There's no body left to this statue. All that is there are the legs. Okay, so the statue has either weathered away or been destroyed or destabilized to the point where it wasn't able to hold up its own weight, and the torso kind of collapses. The legs are still standing though, but that's it. But he calls them vast, so they're pretty big legs apparently. So I just want you to imagine this for a minute. Think about it this way, and if you need to, close your eyes. Maybe it'll help. Okay, that you are traveling through a barren desert wasteland. It's hot. You're sweating. It's been a long trip. The scenery doesn't really change much. It gets kind of boring to look around, but as you sort of move further and further and further into the wasteland, you start to see something on the horizon. You start to see these two little dots. Probably one little dot at first, and as you get closer, you realize it's two pillars. Well, that's odd. You get closer and closer, you realize, this is a statue. These are legs. Okay? And so if you're traveling in the desert, this may be the most exciting thing that you have seen on your trip. And so the traveler is going up to the statue, and then he talks about the visage. So it says, near the legs that are standing in the desert, near those legs, half sunk in the sand, is a visage. Now, a visage is a face, right? There is a face. And so he goes on to describe this face. Half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip the sneer of cold command. Okay, so we see his face. A wrinkled lip, the sneer of cold command. I love the alliterations, cold command. I love the word wrinkled and sneer. They've almost got that kind of, what do you call it? I can't think of it off the top of my head right now. When a word sounds like a sound, onomatopoeia. Anyway, y'all will have to comment, like go to the social media page, let me know what it is because it's going to drive me nuts. So anyway, it's words that kind of sound like what they are, like a snap, right? That was me snapping. Okay, snap. It sounds like the noise, so the word mimics the actual noise. So sneer and wrinkle. I like those kinds of words. But what we know about this statue is that Ozymandias is haughty and arrogant. Okay, Ozymandias knows that he is better than you. Yeah, I said it. He's better than you. Okay, now, regardless of this, in real life, if you look at statues of Ramses II, he looks kind of like he knows a joke, or somebody like told him a secret about you, but you don't really know he knows it. He's got this kind of like mischievous look in his eye. He looks almost kind of like somebody you'd like to talk to, but in this poem, he's very arrogant, haughty, proud. He is better than you, and he knows it. I mean, think about it. He was the Pharaoh of Egypt. What are you the Pharaoh of? Are you the Pharaoh of your living room? Maybe you're the Pharaoh of, I don't know, wherever you work at. Maybe you're not even the Pharaoh of your job. Maybe you're not even the boss. Ozymandias is better than you. Okay, that don't get mad. Okay, don't get mad. I'm just trying to say Ozymandias has achieved power and influence and these sorts of things, rarefied air. Let's just call it that. A world leader of a superpower, not exactly the kind of man who you can compare yourself to and come out on top. We'll just put it that way. Okay? I may be the Pharaoh of this podcast, but good Lord, my kingdom is nothing like the new dynasty of Egypt. Nothing like that. Okay? And so Ozymandias in this poem is a tyrant, and he is obsessed with his own glory and fame and power. He has done fantastic things. He has achieved the pinnacle of human existence, and he knows it. And he wants all of you guys to look back at him and see, you're never gonna get better than this. Right? Like, his son or whoever may be king or queen after him, but Ramses, Ozymandias, he wants them to know you're never going to quite live up to the old man. Yeah, you're never going to get better than me. I'm Ramses the Great. How many people do you know have the Great after their name? Not many. Like I said, rarefied air. And so the poem goes on to tell the sculptor, okay, the sculptor, well, those passions red. Okay, the sculptor seems to be very familiar with Ramses and seems to go out of his way to emphasize the pride, the haughtiness, the arrogance. And it's interesting because the inscription goes on to tell us that he was the King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And I think that the sculptor, the inscriptor who does this, I can just imagine this guy as he puts this together, not rolling his eyes because that'd probably get his head cut off, and an eye roll is not worth having your head roll across the floor. But I can imagine this sculptor sort of getting a flash forward, if you will, seeing Ozymandias as Percy Bysshe Shelley is hearing about him, seeing the statue crumbled, nothing around. Kind of ironic, isn't it? And the sculptor kind of gets the last laugh. He did everything he could to portray Ozymandias as powerful and sneering and cold and haughty. And then by the time we're looking at the statue, there's nothing left. Nothing beside remains. You see, Ozymandias expects you to know and remember his name. He expects that his greatness will survive not just him, but his children and grandchildren unto the ages. He doesn't seem to think that anybody is going to be able to match his accomplishments. Now, to be fair to Ozymandias, certainly his kingdom lasted a long time. We're talking thousands and thousands of years. The Egyptian pharaohs, that ancient Egyptian civilization, was in continuous power with some rises and falls in their actual strength, but they were basically a coherent and cohesive nation and political force for something like, I want to say, 6,000 years? Something like that. Like, we're talking a long time. I could be wrong on that. Feel free to, again, shoot us an email at preachingpoetrypodcast@gmail.com, or by all means, please let us know on social media if you know how long the ancient Egyptian period was. But that kingdom lasted a long time. Ozymandias' statue may have stood a long time. There may have been people 100 years after he was alive, 200, 300, 400 years after he was alive, looking at this. 1,000 years after he died, still looking. I mean, wow, right? But nothing lasts forever. And so, while it says, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," well, Ozymandias isn't really going to make anybody despair anymore. No one's going to look at his power or him and really compare themselves to him, because there's nothing left, because nothing beside remains. Now, a little bit about this poem, okay? One of the themes here is that fame and power, especially political power, is frivolous. Okay, see, Percy Bysshe Shelley resented English imperialism. He was not a fan, he was a critic of it, and he didn't live a terribly long time. He died young. But as a poet, a lot of his work, especially like this one, is critical of this sort of idea of imperial power and majesty. It doesn't last. It's frivolous. It's fickle. And so I can't help but wonder if Percy Bysshe Shelley almost sees Ozymandias as a stand-in for Imperial England. I don't know. But the interesting thing here about this is that there's some weird things to think about on multiple levels. Percy Bysshe Shelley writes a poem about this statue, this Ozymandias, saying that basically he has crumbled into nothing. And yet, just by writing a poem about him, Percy Bysshe Shelley has preserved Ozymandias in people's memory as long as this poem exists. Time may wear down structures, but will it also wear down poetry? You know, the works of Ozymandias have crumbled to dust. There's nothing left. But Shelley's poem is timeless. This poem is written in the 1800s, and yet we're still talking about it today. How long do you think this poem will last? How long do you think our knowledge of Ozymandias will last? And while everything may have crumbled around him, it's almost like he'll never be able to completely go away anymore. He'll never be able to completely crumble because his memory will be preserved in our collective knowledge as people, but also in this poem. And so it's kind of ironic, because we could say the same thing about Percy Bysshe Shelley, right? Like, there's nothing left of him. The artifacts of his life will wear away, they'll be gone. But his poem will live on in literary history, just like Ozymandias or Ramses will live on when we tell the history of Egypt and the history of the world. See, we still know who Ozymandias is today, and most people who know his name, they don't know Ozymandias from studying Egyptian history. They might have heard of Ramses II or Ramses the Great, but if you already knew the name Ozymandias, it's because of Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem. It's ironic that Ozymandias may be better immortalized in poetry than in the remains and ruins of his kingdom. Anyway, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Who knows? Maybe this poem will also fade into the lone and level sands of time. I don't know. So, let's get to the preaching part. Okay? What really does stand the test of time? What lives forever? Art or empire? What do you think? We could say that art lasts longer than empire does. After all, Ramses' empire didn't outlive his statue. But then again, how much art have we lost? Percy Bysshe Shelley, definitely, his poetry has lived longer than he has. And his poetry has outlasted the British Empire. But empire's pretty darn powerful, isn't it? While some empires tend to fall and decay, sometimes they just change. So think about Rome. Rome existing as an empire. Now, granted, the Roman Empire on its own only lasted a few hundred years in any sort of recognizable form, but the Byzantine Empire lasted several hundred years longer than that. And the idea of a Roman Empire began to exist again in things like Charlemagne's kingdom, the Holy Roman Empire, which existed all the way up to Napoleon's time. And then, what about the legacy of that empire? What about the Roman Catholic Church? That still exists. And it's still, in some ways, it's set up like the government of the ancient Roman Empire. The United States, we have a Senate. There are quite a few things that tend to last from empire that tend to have some serious staying power if you stop and think about it. So what sorts of things really do stand the test of time? What lasts forever? Gustave Flaubert once said, "Truth lives forever, men do not." Well, maybe that's true. But if you ask the Roman Catholic Church, they're probably going to tell you that their souls are immortal, that they're going to live forever. Now, it may be eternal destruction in hell, or it may be eternal bliss in heaven, but they will tell you that, no, truth doesn't live forever and men do not. No, truth may live forever, but so are people. People are going to live forever. I don't know. What do you think? There's a lot to chew on there about what sorts of things stand the test of time, what sorts of things have that kind of longevity. But I think an even more important thing for us to consider is, how does this impact us personally? Okay, what about you? What is history going to remember about you? I mean, this podcast, maybe, if nobody just kind of, after I die, the website just gets neglected, the social media gets archived, nobody really looks at it, and then, hundreds of years from now, nothing. But, maybe there's a chance that somebody will, preserve these things or have a transcript of them, and, maybe my kids will pass them down, the text, all the way forever and ever and ever, but maybe not. I mean, there's no way to know. What kinds of things are worthwhile? What is worth spending your time on? Are fame and glory worthwhile pursuits? Is money a worthwhile pursuit? How much of your time do you spend trying to build an empire, trying to accumulate wealth and power and influence, prestige? Do you spend a lot of time thinking about the next status symbol that you're going to go after? Is it, and it may not just be a car or a house or whatever, but could it not also be a relationship? How long are you going to spend trying to find the very perfect husband or wife? Are you looking for something that will stand the test of time, or are you looking for something that's going to make you look good right now? I think these are important questions to ask. And I think that knowing that everything we do is going to crumble in the end gives us some pause. But I think we have to actually take some time to consider, what are the things that will not crumble about our lives? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind? And, maybe it's not kids, maybe it's not family, but is it friends? Is it, through charitable donations, people that you would have helped who then go on to influence the world? Do you believe that certain things that you do can put a ripple out into the world that will ripple into eternity? Is there good that you can do now that may outlive you? I'm sure there is. What does that look like? I don't know. You'll have to figure that part out for yourself. Thank you for listening to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed your time with us, and we look forward to having you back for more. If you like what you heard, please be sure to leave a review, and don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for more content, you can find us on Apple, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, basically anywhere you find podcasts. If you want to join our community or just want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Preaching Poetry.